Welcome to Cornell Keynotes and to the second episode of our One Health Around the World series, featuring the work of the Cornell K Center for Wildlife Health. I'm Dr. Steve Osofsky, director of the center. Our first webinar was about North America, and today we're going to talk about our work in Asia. This is our first webinar under our new center name, and I want to personally thank Lisa Yang for her vision and for her generosity to Cornell University and specifically to our wildlife health work. I want to give you a general overview of the Cornell K Center for Wildlife Health. Our vision, it really is a healthy future for wildlife, people, and planet. And our mission is to transform science and into impact through discovery, education, engagement, and policy to ensure a healthy future for wildlife and for the environment that sustains all of us. And we do this work because we need nature, and now nature needs us. We need nature for all of the ecosystem services that nature provides to sustain us, and nature needs us to be better stewards on into the future. All of the work we do at the center really falls into four main pillars. We respond to the health threats to key species around the world. We provide landscape-level guidance on wildlife-compatible land use policy and practice. We work to minimize disease transfer at the interface of wildlife, livestock, and people. Really, that's where the One Health term comes from. One Health is really a mindset. It's about thinking proactively about the relationships between our own health, the health of our wildlife, the health of our domestic animals, and how all of those things, again, are underpinned by good environmental stewardship. And all of the things that I just described roll up into the final pillar, which is building new constituencies for biodiversity conservation. It's becoming more and more clear over time that sustainable, sound practices in conservation also contribute to better outcomes in public health, agriculture, and other sectors, and we want to continue to build that constituency. Our first speaker today is Dr. Martin Gilbert, a wildlife veterinarian and an epidemiologist and a close colleague for many, many years. And Martin leads our work across Asia. It would be quicker if I listed the countries Martin hasn't worked in, but I will just say that his work has really been on the cutting edge in the One Health realm for decades. Martin, I'm really glad you're here, and I hope the jet lag isn't too bad.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, I have worked as a conservationist in Asia for more than 2 decades now. It's a part of the world that's really got under my skin, although I have spent time working in other countries, in other parts of the world. Asia is a place that I gravitate back to. Asia is a part of the world with a vast diversity of wildlife. It has a diversity of geography, of landscapes, everything from the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia to the highest mountain range on the planet. It also supports a diversity of people and of cultures. It includes some of the densest, most densely populated countries on Earth, but also has vast areas with tiny populations of nomadic pastoralist communities across Central Asia. But as well as working as a conservationist, I'm also a veterinarian. And in this context, that means 2 things. It means rarity and it means health. Now, if in this context, there are very few alternative sources of the way that infectious disease can impact these populations. So, if in small populations if they're exposed to infectious disease, it means that they will decline to extinction. Large populations are robust. They're able to withstand much higher impacts of mortality that would be enough to push populations that are small to the point of extinction. It's also important to remember that these issues are all interconnected. They don't impact just wildlife alone. So the encroachment on wildlife habitats that pushes them into ever smaller islands of habitat. That's also driven by the need for people to make a living. So this encroachment, whether it is in the back caves of southern China or the wildlife markets, the illegal wildlife trade in the big urban centres, either of these have led to the global pandemic that have spread around the world and impacted populations all around the world, hitting millions of people, killing millions of people, and leading to the impacts on business and economics that impact all of us. Also, climate change. Climate change that starts from local impacts that increase the atmospheric carbon, have reverberations that expand far beyond these local areas to ecosystems on the other side of the world, or populations, human populations, countries, communities, far removed from where they started. So although we're focused on wildlife conservation, it's important to remember that these issues are not isolated. They don't affect just wildlife alone. So what I'm going to talk about today I'm going to introduce some of some vignettes of the stories of the work that we do in Asia. I'm going to tell you about populations that are endangered and also are impacted by health. We'll also talk about some of the obstacles that we face and the approaches that we take to overcome them. But ultimately, we're interested in making change. So work that will help us understand these issues and reach out to create partnerships with the other communities, the other disciplines and interest groups that are also impacted by this, so that together we can find solutions that meets everyone's needs. So I thought I would start with a species that's particularly dear to me. This is a species that has received very little research attention across Asia, a carnivore species that few people have heard of. This is a dhole, or an Asiatic wild dog. And I just returned 2 days ago from Thailand, where I've been working with ecologists and veterinarians from Kasetsart University in Bangkok and Smithsonian Institution to understand the threats that are faced by this species. Now, dholes are a species that is probably as rare as the tiger, but is much less known. It's much more poorly known, but to my mind is every bit as enigmatic. Now, dholes are probably the most effective hunters in Asian forests. They work socially as a unit of packs of more than a dozen animals to bring down large prey like deer or wild cattle that are many times their size. They're also a versatile species. So historically, they ranged from as far up as the taiga forests of the Russian Far East, up in the top right of the map there, all the way south across the arid Tibetan Plateau and the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau, south through the forests of India and Southeast Asia, and down through Indonesia as far as the furthest tip of Java. Unfortunately, dhole populations have declined greatly. They have faced impacts of habitat destruction, of declining prey populations, and the persecution that have driven their populations to less than 20% of their former size, such that they're now considered as an endangered species by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. But we're working to understand another threat to these populations, and one that's received very little research attention: infectious disease. So dholes are, like other social canids, like the African wild dogs and Ethiopian wolves, dholes have long been suspected of being susceptible to disease impacts that affect their conservation. They share a lot of the same pathogens that more abundant hosts like domestic dogs or other abundant carnivore species are also susceptible to. And these act as reservoir populations that can act as a constant source of infectious disease for dhole populations. Now these include sarcoptic mange, which you can see in the photograph here. And actually, while we were out in the field in Thailand, we saw a number of cases. We saw a couple of animals that showed signs of sarcoptic mange. But the question really is whether this pathogen has an impact on the population. And more importantly, crucially, where it's coming from. So I'm working with my colleague here, Warisara Thomas, to understand the impact that disease has on dhole populations. Together we are we're doing this by trying to capture dholes, to fit them with satellite telemetry collars, to look at their movement and their interaction with other species, particularly domestic dogs. We're also collecting blood samples to look at the immune responses that they have to pathogens and to parasites that they encounter. And we're working to develop new and sensitive techniques, genetic techniques, to look at the pathogens in dhole scat, or the feces that we find in the forest, so including sarcoptic mange and also another pathogen of importance to carnivore conservation, canine distemper virus. So I've been working with canine distemper with tigers for over a decade now. This work, my research started in the Russian Far East, where canine distemper emerged as a threat to the Amur tigers or Siberian tigers that live there. Now, I think tigers are a population that they're an iconic species. We're all familiar with tigers, but that familiarity can bring complacency. I think it's easy to forget just how threatened tiger populations actually are. So if we go back 100 years, at that time there were populations of maybe 100,000 tigers spreading all the way from the Sea of Japan and the Russian Far East in the east, all the way west as far as eastern Turkey and the Caspian Sea. They were found throughout China and India, south through Southeast Asia, and right down into Indonesia, as far as Bali. Jump forward to 2005, and populations had declined to barely a fragment of their range, down to just 7% of their former range. At that time, we'd already lost 3 of the 9 subspecies. So it was tigers in Bali, disappeared in the 1940s. The Javan tigers in the 70s, and also the Caspian tigers disappeared around a similar time. But these declines have continued, such that over the last 10 to 15 years, we've lost tigers as a breeding species in the countries of Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, such that the Indo-Chinese tiger is now almost completely wiped out. It's only found in the areas of very western Thailand along the border with Burma. So as with the dholes, tigers are now, their populations are critically reduced, and they're considered an endangered species by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So my work in Russia that became the focus of my PhD actually had some surprising findings. Rather unexpectedly, we found that tigers were not being exposed to the virus through domestic dogs as we expected, but they were catching it from other wild carnivores, such as foxes or badgers or raccoon dogs. Now, this was important because it meant that we couldn't manage the virus through vaccination of domestic dogs. And so we're now working to try and come up with strategies and develop strategies to deliver vaccines, not to dogs, but to tigers themselves as the only feasible means of protecting this population. Now, looking elsewhere, south of Russia, where previously the impact of distemper was completely unknown in tigers, this brings us to one of the key challenges that we face, and that is the movement of samples internationally. So regulations in the collection of samples from endangered species, and critically the movement of them for wildlife trade regulations, prevent us from getting samples out to international specialist laboratories to get them analysed. And so to resolve this, we've rather than be taking the sample to the lab, we've been turning that on its head and taking the lab to the sample and introducing the techniques that we need to analyze tiger samples in the countries where tigers live. So we've been introducing techniques to measure antibodies against distemper in tiger sera to Thailand, to Indonesia, to Nepal. Through this work, we've shown that tigers in Sumatra and tigers in Nepal have been exposed to distemper, albeit at lower levels than we see in the Russian Far East. But we've also been finding some more worrying indications. In particular, we found that a third of the leopards in Nepal are exposed to the virus. And this has coincided with the increasing social media videos and posts like this one of leopards showing central nervous signs that are classic of canine distemper and are really quite sad. And I froze the video here because this gets even more distressing. We think now that that distemper is becoming an important cause of mortality for leopards in Nepal. And this is likely to be because leopards are predating on dogs, which is exposing them to the virus to a greater degree than to tigers. Now, I'm going to be passing over later to Laura to provide some more background on the work that we're doing to understand this. So I'll don't want to steal her thunder, but I'll suffice to say that we do think that canine distemper is an issue for leopards, but this is also more indicative of the wider consequences. So as leopards are coming into communities and taking domestic dogs, it's also placing them at risk of conflict with people, whether that be through predation of livestock or attacks on people themselves. So resolving this conflict between leopards and people is better for both leopards and people because it resolves it creates a better future for that is safer and healthier for both, well, for all concerned. Also in Nepal, we're working with the National Trust for Nature Conservation and the Department of National Parks and Wildlife Conservation to understand a new threat to the greater one-horned rhinoceros, the greater one-horned rhinos, particularly in the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Chitwan National Park. Now, greater one-horned rhinos are the true unicorns of Asia. They are now reduced to just a few small protected areas in northeast India and in Nepal along the base of in grasslands that lie at the base of the Himalayan mountain chain. Now, just like their African cousins, they have a history of being poached for their horns. But in Nepal, the government has implemented over the last 10 or 15 years control measures on poaching that has really reduced it down to near negligible levels. However, in the last 10 years, we've also seen an increase in the mortality in rhinos in Chitwan National Park, particularly, for unknown reasons. Now, once again, the main obstacle to understanding this is the shipment of samples. Although this time, the problems that we face are not access to laboratory testing available internationally, but access to the international wildlife pathologist specialists that are not present as a discipline in Nepal. So to address this, I'm working with my local colleagues in Nepal to prepare tissue sections, so glass slides from these rhino cases in local laboratories. We're then working with a group based out of Finland called Grundium, who produce a very robust, field-friendly digital microscope with which we can digitize copies of these slides and share them with wildlife pathologists based internationally around the world. They are then able to feed back the findings that they get from those to the wildlife veterinarians in country, who are able to use that information to understand the causes of mortality and design management interventions that will help reduce avoidable losses in the population. Now, already we're starting to get some hints of that this issue affecting the rhinos might be affecting the wider ecosystem. So potentially being more than just the rhinos, affecting also other wildlife, domestic animals, and even people. We're seeing signs in the liver of some of these animals that is hints at a toxicity that links to algal blooms in particular. So what we may be seeing here is rhinos may be acting as a sort of a two-ton signpost to wider issues that are affecting the ecosystem more widely. So I think you can see from these tiger and rhino examples that a lot of our issues or our projects are focused on overcoming logistical issues of working to diagnose diseases in remote and hard to reach areas. And this is particularly true in Central Asia, where we're working with groups that are focused on the conservation of snow leopards. And for an area to be suitable for the conservation of snow leopards, for the survival of snow leopards, it needs prey populations. And that means these mountain sheep and goats that live in some of the most remote areas on Earth. And so we are working with rangers in these remote areas that are far from electricity or veterinary support to provide them with low-tech solutions so that they can collect samples in these hard-to-reach areas. These are just simple filter paper sample strips with which they can soak up blood samples, which they can then dry and take them out of the mountains to the laboratories in the capital city for analysis. And we're working to perfect techniques of analyzing these to be able to measure antibodies to pathogens like sarcoptic mange that you can see in this Siberian ibex here, so that we can really start to understand the impact of these pathogens. But of course, all of this work is geared towards being able to address these issues and find solutions to resolve them. Now, Helen's going to be talking about this in some more detail in a moment, but just suffice to say that the main threats to these wild ungulate populations rest in livestock. Livestock share infectious diseases that their wild cousins are also susceptible to. They also compete for grazing resources in these low productive ecosystems at high altitude, such that they will push the wild ungulates off and off those pasture resources and make life difficult for them in these areas. So we've been working with veterinary students at Cornell, together with Tajik veterinarians, to understand the health of the livestock, but also with the local communities to understand the challenges that they face, so that ultimately we can work with them to craft solutions that work locally so that they can increase the profitability of their livestock and the productivity of their livestock, such as they can maintain their livelihoods with smaller, more productive livestock herds that are able to be reared with a lower environmental impact on these high altitude ecosystems. So before I finish, I just would like to say a quick word of thank you to several people who've been crucial to our work from the outset. Tom and Abetz Judson and Ivy and Ron Timpey, who both have supported our work, but also shown a personal interest that has been really critical to everything that we do. Also, as I said earlier, all of this work is reliant on partnerships. And so we've been working with governments, non-government organizations, with multilaterals, with academia and diagnostic laboratories all around the world to make this work possible. So I hope you can see in these examples of just a taste of the kind of work that we're doing. We're not just trying to study in an academic format the impact of infectious disease on these populations. It's a very practical approach that we're taking to turn science into action, to be able to conserve these species in the areas that they live.
It's great. Martin, thank you for such a great range of examples. And I'm going to bring in Laura Burnett, who is going to introduce herself, but she was an undergraduate with Cornell and now is a first-year vet student. And Laura, you had a fantastic experience this past summer in and around Nepal's Chitwan National Park with Dr. Gilbert and with Shashank Pudel, a Nepali graduate student at Cornell. So tell us more about what that experience was like.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Laura Berner. I am, as Dr. Osofsky said, I am a graduate of Cornell University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and I am currently a first-year DVM candidate at Cornell University's College of Veterinary Medicine. And I was very lucky last summer to get the opportunity to travel to Nepal and get to work on some of these issues like canine distemper virus and human and wildlife conflict. So last May and June, I traveled with Dr. Gilbert and Shashank Pudel out of the Fuller Lab at Cornell to Saraha, which is in the buffer zone of Chitwan National Park in south central Nepal. These are some of the photos that I took while I was there. You can see the Rapti River is pictured in both of these photos, and that's sort of the dividing line between Chitwan National Park and the town of Saraha, where I lived and worked while I was there. And hopefully you can appreciate on the right, it was very crowded while we were there. Saraha is actually a major tourist destination, both domestic and internationally, drawing people in hopes of seeing rare and endangered species. And while that's great for ecotourism and for the local economy, it certainly presents challenges in terms of human and wildlife conflict, and that was the focus of some of my research while I was there. So one of my projects was focused specifically on human and leopard conflict, and I was working with Shashank Pudel out of the Fuller Lab at Cornell, and he and his team had already pulled over 200 leopard scats, so fecal samples from the foothills region of Nepal. And my job was to molecularly confirm that these samples did belong to leopards by doing a DNA extraction and a PCR amplification. And you can see I'm doing that on the left. And then in addition, we did a diet analysis on these samples in order to get a sense of what tigers were eating, where they were located, and try and correlate that to any factors related to human and leopard conflict. So on the left, I'm pulling hairs for our medullary hair analysis. So we would pull up to 40 hairs from each sample and then mount them on microscopic slides and visualize them. And because each prey species has a characteristic hair pattern that can be seen under a microscope, by doing this analysis, we can get a sense for what leopards are eating. And the overall goal of this research is to create a national level policy document for the management of leopards in order to hopefully mitigate human and wildlife conflict. So in addition to this, I also did a free-roaming dog census in conjunction with what Dr. Gilbert talked about with the threat posed to leopards by canine distemper virus, or CDV, in Nepal. So these were some photos that I took of dogs while I was in Nepal, and hopefully you can appreciate that none of them are really attached to any particular person. And that's because dogs in Nepal generally follow what's called a free-roaming lifestyle. So they're not attached to any person in particular. And while Good Samaritans might leave out food, they also subside off of garbage or other remnants of human civilization. In general, these populations don't receive routine veterinary care, and they're not sterilized, so the population can grow unmonitored over time. And this presents challenges through a couple of avenues. First, from the wildlife conservation perspective, as Dr. Gilbert spoke about, these dogs do carry canine distemper. Previous seroprevalence studies out of the area had estimated about 80% of these dogs show evidence of prior exposure to CDV. So certainly that's a large disease burden, and it could potentially spread to big cats that are just neighboring in Chitwan National Park. Additionally, there's the public health perspective. That's a concern. These dogs are not vaccinated for rabies, so that presents challenges in human health. And lastly, there's the animal welfare perspective. So animal welfare groups are interested in curbing these dog populations humanely. And I actually worked with one such organization, the Himalayan Animal Rescue Trust, while I was there. And my free-roaming dog census formed the baseline data for a prospective spay, neuter, and anti-rabies campaign in the Chitwan National Park buffer zone. So this project was really fun for me because a lot of my training henceforth had been in a lab and doing sort of the back-end research. But for this, I got to actually get feet on the ground, which was great while I was in Nepal. So I collected the data myself, and these are some of the photos I took while I was there. We surveyed 10 blocks in and around Saraha over 5 days. And we did what's called a mark recapture estimate to account for any dogs we might have missed on the first pass. So the top row photos are all dogs within block 10, and we took photos of every dog we saw in the first pass, and then we came back the next day and took photos of every dog we saw. And by matching these photos and accounting for any missed dogs, we can get a multiplier to basically tighten our estimate and get a more accurate count of how many dogs we might be dealing with. So this is important from a wildlife health perspective because big cats are living right on top of these domestic dog populations, and I saw both direct and indirect evidence of that while I was in Nepal. So indirectly, you can see on the left, this is a rhino that presented at the National Trust for Nature Conservation with a suspected big cat wound, and on the right, there's a big cat print that I saw myself while I was inside the park participating in a guided tour. And luckily, I was able to see an actual leopard while I was there. It was definitely the highlight of my trip, and while that was a thrilling experience just to see it, it also drove home the importance of the work we were doing. Obviously, leopards are living right on top of where the domestic dogs are. This photo I took myself through binoculars. The leopard was maybe 100 meters from the tent where I was sleeping. So these big cats are living right on top of domestic dogs, and the presence of CDV in these unmonitored populations poses a huge threat to leopard health in Nepal. So this is just one more example, I could not put it in, of how wildlife lives right on top of civilization in the buffer zone of Nepal. This is a full-grown rhino just walking through the street, and hopefully you can appreciate how this presents the opportunity both for human and wildlife conflict and for disease spread between domestic and wildlife. One more video. Just a typical evening in Saraha. So this is me at the end of my trip with my research poster that I presented to the NTNC, the National Trust for Nature Conservation, who were hosting me. And this trip, my main takeaways were just how interrelated domestic, human, and wildlife health is in this sensitive region of Nepal. And going forward with my veterinary training, it's left an impact on me to realize, just how diverse the role of the wildlife veterinarian is in that part of the world, how they're not just veterinary professionals, but also epidemiologists and pathologists. And even the role of the general practitioner veterinarian is extremely important in maintaining the health of domestic species, but also the wildlife that live right on top of domestic species. So, yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Helen now, but I'd be happy to take any questions at the end.
Yeah, no, Laura, that was fantastic. And I just like to tell our audience we're very excited that we were able to get students like you into the field, whether it's from the Einaudi Center support or Engage Cornell or Expanding Horizons or the Cornell Yang Center for Wildlife Health Student Support Fund. It's really important for us to have you learn about this stuff in class, but then see it. And what you described, the intensity of that interface between domestic dogs and the big cats, I mean, it'll leave an impression on you, I believe, for the rest of your career. So let us know when you're ready to hire Martin, because he might be,
For sure.
So I'm going to introduce our final speaker before we may have time for discussion and some questions. Our next speaker is Helen Lee, our conservation and livelihood specialist, and she works to explore how conservation can best contribute to sustainable poverty alleviation and basically how to make conservation an economically rational land use choice, which is a real theme of our work at the center. Helen and Martin and I have been working together for many, many years, and I'll also note that Helen is double red, having gone to undergrad at Cornell, and you majored in applied economics and management, and then while you were working for us and helping us try and save the world, you also got your MBA. So you've been busy, and you're going to talk to us about, again, the economic dimensions of the One Health work we've been doing. So Helen, please.
Thank you so much, Steve. So my area of interest is looking at finding solutions to conservation challenges that benefit both the livelihoods of local communities and the sustainability of the surrounding wildlife and environment. And to do this, my focus is on engaging with local communities living closest to wildlife to understand their needs and challenges, what's driving their behaviors and decisions, and then to work closely with them to develop more practical and holistic solutions that can be sustained by these communities. So a great example of this is a One Health project in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan that Martin touched on earlier, and I'm just going to take a deeper dive into this project and talk about how we've been using a One Health approach to empower local herding communities to use more sustainable practices in the landscapes they share with wildlife. So just to quickly orient you, Tajikistan is in Central Asia next to China, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan. And on the eastern side of the country is the Pamir mountain range, also known as the roof of the world, because it's one of the highest and most inaccessible mountainous areas on Earth. And because it's at such a high altitude, it's really hard for things to grow here, and there's just really limited resources. So within these mountains, there are local herding communities that live there who depend on their livestock for food and income. And it's also home to threatened wildlife like snow leopards and wild goats and sheep, which the snow leopards depend on as food. And so in general, this ecosystem is increasingly at risk from unsustainable numbers of livestock, which is causing environmental degradation and potential disease spread between wildlife, livestock, and people. So we're working with these Pamir communities to find ways that they can have smaller but healthier and more productive livestock herds to hopefully increase their income and improve their livelihoods while reducing their environmental footprint, which will then help the local wildlife. So essentially, how to do more with less. So our objective was to identify constraints and inefficiencies impacting household income that could be improved through either veterinary interventions or changes in livestock management and marketing. And we also wanted to identify market opportunities for sustainable commercialization of livestock products. And I just wanted to mention that this was very much a team effort. We had people with expertise in conservation, wildlife and livestock health, economics, and marketing. And we also worked closely with local NGO partners and village community members. So we used these 4 methods: participatory rural assessments, which were small group discussions with farmers to understand their needs and challenges; livelihood household surveys, which collected data on everything from demographics to livestock health and how the farmers were selling and managing their herds. We also did animal health and husbandry assessments, So, for example, we tested for pathogens like Brucella, which can also spread to wildlife and people. And finally, we did a value chain analysis, which pretty much mapped out the general market framework and looked at how products were flowing from the farmer all the way to the end consumer and where there might be areas for improvement. So using all these methods, working with local communities, we were able to get a more holistic picture of what was happening in these different systems and landscapes. So some of our key findings on the animal health side showed that there was a strong seasonal environment with a short growing season, and this was making it difficult for farmers to sustainably manage their livestock herds. So for example, we found that poor nutrition was a big constraint, and this was setting the farmers up for this vicious cycle of slow growth rates where they have to keep the animals longer until they're fat enough to sell. This ends up taking more resources, and it increases the animal's risk of death as they stay longer on these harsher landscapes. The farmers respond by increasing their herd size, which then increases pressure on the local resources. This compounds all these issues, leading back to poor nutrition and just starting the cycle all over again. We also found that larger herds were actually less productive than smaller herds. And while we did find widespread anemia from parasites, we actually generally found a low presence of infectious disease, despite what local farmers thought were a major issue. So some of our key findings on our value chain analysis showed that there were weak connections in information flow between buyers and sellers. So for example, a lot of farmers expressed that sometimes they didn't know when traders were going to show up to buy their livestock, and so this led to missed sales opportunities and wastage. We also found that there's an inconsistent supply of quality products, and this is partly due to the poor nutrition and slow growth rates that I mentioned earlier. And this is causing supply shortages and lost revenue. This photo on the left, for example, shows a butcher that had been in the middle of interviewing when all of a sudden he received this huge sack of fresh meat from a local farmer, and before he could even finish bringing it into his shop, a crowd of people just flooded into his store trying to buy a piece of meat because it had been the first time he'd had meat in over a week. So clearly at that time they were experiencing a supply shortage. So some of the key opportunities we found were that there's actually an increasing market demand for livestock products, and that there's potential for new markets and partnerships. This photo on the right, for example, shows some women who were selling yak milk products, and they decided to partner together, share operating costs, and cross-sell their goods, and essentially find more success working as a cooperative than individually. So by using a One Health approach, we were able to get a broader view of what was happening between these different animal and livelihood systems. And this helped us be able to develop more holistic solutions, again, with the goal of finding ways for the farmers to have smaller but healthier and more productive livestock herds so that they can increase their income while reducing pressure on the local ecosystems they share with wildlife. If we had come in, say, just looking for infectious diseases, we may have missed all these other major issues at play. So just as an example of a potential solution, earlier I mentioned from our findings, we know that there's poor nutrition and slow growth rates, and this is causing poor productivity, increased pressure on local resources for wildlife and livestock, and it's also causing supply shortages and lost revenue. We also know that there's an opportunity to strengthen value chain connections and that there's an increasing market demand for livestock products. So given the short growing season and how hard it is to fatten animals up quickly in this landscape, what if we could develop a new system where we strengthen value chain connections and find ways to sell younger, healthier animals to middlemen to fatten up somewhere else where there's more resources? This could then potentially increase income and help meet the growing market demand and improve the quality of the products. And it would also reduce the number of livestock staying in these fragile ecosystems, which could then create opportunities to set aside areas for wildlife and ecotourism, which are also important sources of income for these communities. So lastly, I just wanted to highlight the importance of engaging with local communities and taking the time to understand and incorporate their perspectives and experiences into our solutions, because at the end of the day, they know their landscape and resources the best. I was personally just really humbled by being able to spend time with these families, listening to them talk, and just how open they were in sharing their personal stories, their day-to-day struggles, and their successes. And I think it just goes back to what I said in the beginning, which is that it's all about working with the people living closest to wildlife, because they have to be the ones who are taking the lead in implementing these solutions. Because ultimately, wildlife, livestock, people, they all have a place on this landscape. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about the Cornell K. Lisa Yang Center for Wildlife Health, please visit our website at wildlife.cornell.edu, where you can sign up for a newsletter and also follow us on social media at Wildlife Cornell. Thank you.
People can scan that QR code and get to our link tree and get all kinds of great information. So we have some time for discussion amongst us and for some questions from the audience. I just reflecting on what you've said, I mean, I think it's our students often come to veterinary college, to the veterinary school, and I was like this in my 20s, thinking that wildlife conservation is about wildlife. But I think you've all made a pretty clear case that much of it relates to people and human activities, and that relationship between global to local, I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about many of the issues, for example, that are reflective of the impacts of climate change. You know, climate change is a global problem. Some of the greenhouse gases that are being generated in the United States, for example, are having impacts on some of the ecosystems we've been talking about today. So we sometimes lose sight of the fact that it is a small world in that sense. And I think some of the things you're seeing, certainly demonstrate that these linkages are there. We can't solve all these problems at the local scale. We have to sort of work top down and bottom up. And I think if we had more time, we could describe more of the endeavors where we're working at the policy level, but we'll get into some of that. We have a few questions from our viewers. I'll just pick some of them that I was scanning through. Aditya wanted to know if there are related reports to what you were describing, Martin, in the Kaziranga rhino population. I mean, what's happening in India compared to Nepal in terms of rhinos?
I mean, I don't want to give the impression that there's just one thing going on in Nepal. We're seeing rhinos dying from a range of different things, and there's certainly some similarities with what's happening in northeast India that we see in Nepal. So particularly related to conflict. So where rhinos are feeding in agricultural areas outside of the periphery of these parks, that puts them into direct competition with people. I mean, a rhino can eat tens of kilos of rice in a sitting, that has a real impact on local communities. And so sometimes both in northeast India and in Nepal, that bites back at the rhinos, unfortunately, and particularly electrocutions are a common cause of mortality in both places. However, with the contacts that we've had with veterinarians over in northeast India, they haven't been seeing these other sort of unexplained mortalities that we're seeing well, particularly in Chitwan. Even within Nepal, there's a couple of different sites where we have rhinos, and this particularly seems to be a Chitwan problem. So.
Yeah, and I realize there's more work to do, but the entire hydrological system there might make you suspect that there have been changes over time that could be contributing to things like algal blooms.
It certainly could, and that's something that will be we're in the midst of looking at right now.
A question from Ed. And I'll start with you, Laura. And we sort of talked about the fact we work in many places and we have to work in many cultural contexts. Given the challenges that we're seeing at the domestic dog, big cat interface, what is the local perspective on things like sterilizing, spaying and neutering, or even culling dogs as dealing with the public health risk of rabies? I mean, in some countries that is something that is used to help manage. What did you see when you were there?
For sure. The culling of dogs is something that has come up. It's of particular concern to animal welfare groups like Himalayan Animal Rescue Trust. So I would say there's not a lot of resources on the local level to deal with it. A lot of it has been NGOs coming in, like HART, the Himalayan Animal Rescue Trust, coming into local communities and intervening in a split second. But those interventions aren't maintained by the local government over time. And so we don't have a lot of longitudinal data assessing the size of the population. Because of that, the dog population is sometimes cold. People take matters into their own hands. And certainly that's in part because of the risk of rabies. And there's other concerns like dogs encroaching on people's resources and things like that that lead people to take those measures. But in general, I would say there's not a lot of support for the local people in dealing with this issue. And it's something that could be dealt with through collaborations between wildlife groups, animal welfare groups, and public health groups.
Thank you.
I mean, that's certainly the issue that Laura refers to there with the people taking matters into their own hands. With some of our dhole surveys in Nepal, something that comes through regularly, we ask about poisoning of local dogs, and that is commonly occurring in response to rabies outbreaks locally. That has wider implications for other carnivores and also for scavenging species in Nepal, particularly vultures. So there's critically endangered vulture populations in lowland Nepal that a single poisoning event can wipe out years of work to build up a local population, and killing tens in a single incident.
Yeah, no, that type of conflict is really having extraordinary impacts. Related to the dholes, Chris wanted to know if you could tell us more about, what dholes really are in terms of how they compare with wolves and jackals and coyotes and other canids.
Well, they are canids. They are closely related to the African wild dogs or the painted dogs. They're essentially the sort of the Asian equivalent of. They do have some modifications that set them a little apart from other dogs, particularly with their dentition that ecologically sort of forces them into being more pure carnivores. They rely on meat as a diet rather than being more omnivorous as some of the other dog species are.
No, thank you. Aaron wants to know more about some of the technology. You mentioned taking the lab to the animal, and that's been a big issue. So you talked about the Grundium scanning microscope. Could you talk more about some of the remote diagnostics, and maybe you've learned a lot about where distemper is in tigers around Asia with our partners, and you would not have been able to do that had you not been able to do your diagnostics tiger side, so to speak.
Sure. And so previously we have worked to develop field molecular approaches to screen animals in the field for to conduct PCR reactions with handheld devices that essentially fit onto your mobile phone, rather like a sort of Star Trek kind of arrangement. So certainly those are something that we've been using. Also, progressively, often we face issues with laboratory resources in countries, particularly with genetic sequencing. And so you're now able to sequence your own viruses in the field with mobile scanners that you can or mobile sequencers rather, that you can fit on your laptop, that you're able to do that sort of in a fairly basic field setting in a laboratory.
No, absolutely. We know we are dealing with a range of threats to a lot of the wild places that we're concerned about, and local people are in need of support in many places. In terms of our work, how would you say, what is the lens that you feel that you're using most? In other words, there are lots of challenges we could be working on, but I think it's fair to say, are, as you said, we're not focusing on academic questions, where we're looking at where wildlife health issues are actually potentially make or break for conservation of a given species or system. There are other threats. We've talked about some of them. The human-wildlife conflict as manifested through things like poisonings. We didn't talk a lot about poaching. We talked a little bit about wildlife trade at the beginning. Can you say more, Martin, about how we look at that range of threats, because they're additive, obviously, and why you think wildlife health is perhaps continues to get less than adequate attention compared to more visible threats like poaching or illegal hunting in different places?
Well, I think, I think this falls outside of the primary areas that conservationists are traditionally looking at. So, and it's more of an issue that affects populations as they're getting smaller, where sort of large populations are able to withstand infectious disease outbreaks and the like. As we in the modern day, so many of these wildlife populations are sort of reduced into very small sort of islands of habitat that disease is starting to come into the sort of the radar. But ultimately, most of the pressures, or really all of the pressures that are impacting wildlife and wildlife conservation are human. And so sometimes we, just in the example that Helen described, health doesn't need to be part of the problem. It can actually be part of the solution to work with those local communities to actually help do things in a more sort of conducive way, to live in a way that is more balanced with the wildlife populations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that relates to a question from Sahithi, who wants to know how One Health relates to declining habitat. And I think that's part of what we're hoping to convey here today, that this is so much of what we do is about reconciling land use conflicts, often between agriculture and conservation. And if we can, as you said, Helen, do more with less, and there's room for the domestic goats and sheep, there's room for the wild goats and sheep, and then at the top of the food chain, the top of the food pyramid, the snow leopard can persist. It really is about making better land use decisions. And so to me, One Health is very much about thinking about the system. It's not just about the disease or the particular animal or the individual village. It's about the landscape and how can we make the most of the limited resources that any one part of the world has. So I think that was a really helpful question. There's questions about interventions, and so Martin, this may be our last question because I think we're getting close to time. But can you say anything, even though I know that some of this is preliminary, you alluded to the fact that your original PhD research pointed to an interesting finding that at least in the Russian Far East, compared to other places, it's not the dogs that are the main problem in terms of where the reservoir of distemper is. If we have to vaccinate species like tigers, what kind of technologies might we need to do that?
Well, there are existing technologies in that instance, canine distemper virus. Right now, the only vaccines that we have are injectable. And so essentially that would require us going out and either remotely darting tigers or capturing tigers and being able to hand deliver vaccines. So something that we've been working on doing is looking at oral delivery mechanisms for delivering canine distemper vaccines. And so again, this is still very early in development, but if we can be able to deliver a vaccine through a bait that is laced with the vaccine that tigers will then take, then that will greatly increase our capacity to get vaccines out into the environment. But ultimately, the aim of vaccinating tigers in the field is very different than what we would try to do with the likes of COVID, where you're aiming to get the coverage up to a very high level of the population. really we're looking at just vaccinating very small numbers of tigers to be able to increase the resilience of those populations to be able to withstand future outbreaks. So this is work that's ongoing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remind people that we're not generally trying to intervene in situations that are really natural. A lot of the viruses that we're dealing with are perhaps imported by human activities. In many cases, they're essentially alien invasive species in some of the ecosystems we work in. So we're very mindful of trying to solve problems that are really often anthropogenic, human-caused, and we're not interfering in otherwise natural systems. And frankly, as you said early on, as some of these populations get smaller and smaller, some of these disease issues, some of them that are novel, that these species haven't been exposed to until recently, could be what tips that last domino towards extinction. So I think that's all the time we have. And I would just thank our panelists, and it's great to have you all here. And we'll be probably continuing this series with other parts of the world, but I just want to remind our viewers, wildlife.cornell.edu is our website. There's quite a bit of information on all of our programs in Asia and around the world. And we hope you enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.